Today we are going to be making a smocked Louise. So I'm going to go through some of the things you will need. I'm going to be working with the revised Louise, and it comes as a PDF, which is what I'm using, and it also comes in tissue. If you have the old Louise, it will still work just fine. The order of construction may be a little different. In fact, the order of construction is even going to be different if you've got the revised Louise because of the smock skirts we're going to do. So there will be a PDF or an instruction sheet that you can print off, and you need to do that because you will need new measurements, new widths for your skirts. They'll need to be fuller so that you can smock them. I'm using a lawn weight, and so I have fused just a lightweight baby interfacing on this, and what I think it does is it just kind of plumps the pleats a little bit when it's a lightweight fabric like this. It makes the pleats a little more defined, so it makes it, to me, it makes it easier to smock, to see those pleats, but that's just personal preference. But any other weight of fabric, just a regular cotton quilt weight, you don't need to do that. If you are making a size 8 or larger, you will need to have your fabric be in the 55 to 60 inch range because you really don't want to put a seam in your fabric for your skirts. Then let's see, you will need your Louise front and back, and for the revised version you actually have a separate back lining piece, and the facing on the back wraps around. You will also need to cut your placket strip, and it will need to be wider than usual, so be sure and look at your instruction sheet for that. It will need to be 2.5 inches wide so that it will finish at 1 inch wide, which is a little different than what we usually do. Let's see, I'm going to go ahead and get started. You're not going to pleat very many rows or smock very many rows. Most likely you will pleat 8 and smock 5 or 6. And I like, just because this is a print, I'm just going to use a simple geometric design. So what you will need to do is mark the center of your panel and then get it pleated. And then the same for the back, or same for the front and the back. You want them both pleated, and once you have got that, then you need to go through and right at your center, we're working with the back right now. So at your center back, you're going to just take like the eye of a needle and pull the pleater threads up right at that center back so that you've got a good sized loop there. And after you've done that with all of your pleater threads, you need to cut them right there. After you cut them, tie them off 2 or 3 at a time. But before you tie them off, I almost forgot to tell you, before you tie them off, pull one pleat out on each side, or whatever it takes to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is usually just one pleat. And then after you do that, you will tie them off. But before you go any further in pulling up your fabric to be ready to smock, you need to go ahead and stitch your placket in. And you can just follow the instructions with your pattern on putting the placket in. And then we will be ready to tie off the other side. And don't tie it off without listening to the next section of the video, because it is a little different in the way you determine how wide you tie off the left side of the back and how wide you tie off the right side of the back. So I'm going to get my threads cut, one pleat on each side of the center back. I'll pull out so that you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You'll cut your slit for your placket and get your placket sewn in, and then we'll be back to tie off the other sides. We need to tie off the other side of your skirt backs, and so you'll need your bodice, your back bodice. And if you're using the revised Louise, you'll have a back bodice that looks like this and has a fold line right here. And that's what you want to line up with this edge of your placket. So on the left-hand side of your skirt, you leave the placket out so it's laying flat. If you are using the older Louise pattern, your back will look a little different. You won't have a fold line. Instead, you will have a you'll have a cut line, and then you'll have a dotted line for your seam allowance. You're going to line that up with the dotted line for the seam allowance. And then once you have got your placket pinned 3 or 4 times so it stays put, then go over to the other side, and you'll be pulling out 1 or 2 pleats to get a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it may be that you end up with a little more than 1/4 inch. That's okay. You can trim it down when you get ready to do the side seams of your skirts. And I actually have already, I had this pinned down, and I've already tied off this side. I didn't think you necessarily needed me to see me tie that off. So I've got this side done now, so I can take out the pins and go to the right-hand side of my skirt. And with the right-hand side, we're going to do it a little different. I'm going to flip my pattern piece over, and I can see that fold line through the paper. So I'm going to pin this back down again, and then on the right-hand side of my skirt, we are going to fold the placket to the inside. So I can see that fold line right there. So I'm just going to pin my folded edge where I just have that first pleat showing. And then on this side, I like to just go ahead and pull up a little tighter than what I really need. And then go back and pull out this edge so that it lines up with the side on the right-hand side of your skirt. And then again, just pin to hold it in place. It kind of gives you a third hand when you do this. So an ironing board is a great tool to use for this. Also a lace shaping board works well too. And so then I'm going to go through and tie off all of these threads the same way, 2 at a time. And then for the front, you'll do the same thing. You won't have a placket, but you will just take your front pattern piece. And what you can do with this, since this is just half of your front, you can measure across from the center front over to the side, and then multiply that by 2, and that will be the length that you need to tie off your front. Again, pulling out threads on each side for a seam allowance. And then, so for instance, this is a size 5 and it measures 7 1/4. So what I need to tie off for this one would be 14 1/2. So once you've got your skirts tied off, go ahead and smock them. The first row of pleater thread is a holding row, and the last row is a holding row. So depending on the size and how many rows of smocking you want, just be sure you leave a holding row at the top and a holding row at the bottom. So get everything smocked, and we'll be back to start construction. So after you have got your smocking all done, go ahead and cut out your bodice, front and back, and your lining. Also, if you plan to pipe anywhere on your bodice, go ahead and cut piping for that. But the main thing you do need to do is have piping that will go across the bottom of the bodices, both the front and the back, and then it's just personal preference whether you pipe the neckline or the armholes. That's just totally up to you, but you will need piping for the bottom of the front bodice and the bottom of the 2 back bodices. So I'll see you back here when you've got your smocking all done. Okay, I've got my bodice finished. up to step 14. And that's where the instructions will be telling you to put the side seams together and stitch. So normally you would be doing this, matching the lining fabric, matching the dress fabric, and doing that side seam. But I'm going to wait to do that and get the skirts attached to the bottom of the bodices first. I could do it the way the instructions show, where you do the side seams of the skirt and then put it on. I just felt like this might be easier, and I might get a better result doing it this way. So I've piped across the bottom of the both front and back bodices. On the back, I eased on or eased off at that fold. So at the fold, you need to have it a 1/2 inch from the edge, but then just ease off into the part that is the facing that folds to the back. And I forgot that this was a 1/2 inch seam allowance and trimmed my piping to a 1/4 inch, but I did stitch it on at a 1/2 inch. So what I really like to use with this is Wonder Tape. And it's just a water soluble tape, it's really sticky, it's double-sided. So I'm going to put it right along the seam allowance of the bottom of the bodice. Put it down here so I can push it down real good. So now I'm ready to take the other side of this tape off. There. Now I can flip the seam allowance to the inside so that I can place it right where I want it on the skirt. So I'm placing it so that the piping is just above that first row of smocking. The nice thing about this is you can reposition it if you're not happy with it. And so right here, I'm going to take this up a second. So right here at this folded edge of the on this side, it would be the folded edge of the placket, and the fold line of the bodice where the facing starts, those match. And then I've just pressed to make sure that tape is going to hold everything in place. And then I had my skirt held down with pins along here, so I need to take those up now. So now I can flip it back, and with my piping foot, I'll stitch right on that same stitching line. And after I do this side, I'll do the other side the same way. And then we will come back and talk about stitching the front, the piping on the, matching the piping with the front skirt. So get this pinned on, or get this stitched on, and we'll be right back. Now we're ready for the front skirt. I'm going to take this side of the tape off, and now I'm ready to start placing the seam allowance of the piping right above the smocking. So I'm going to keep the lining out of the way. Just press that down so it's right there above that first row of smocking. Okay, so I'm ready to stitch along that stitching line. I'll take these out. So I'll stitch right along that same line, and then for both the front and the back, you'll trim your seam allowance down. You'll have more seam allowance of the pleated fabric because of having a holding row and then your first row for smocking. But that'll all get trimmed away down to 1/4 of an inch on both the front and the back. So I'll get this done, and then we'll talk about the side seams. Now we're ready for the side seams. Start by placing where the lining and the fabric meet at the armhole. Match that seam. And then move down to where the piping starts at the bottom of your bodice. And I can't remember if I told you, but if I didn't, be sure and pull out some cording from your piping. A little over 1/4 of an inch, maybe close to 1/2 an inch, just so it cuts down on the bulk right there at that seam. And then place your piping so that it lays right on top of each other, and put a pin right there. And as you're sewing, even though we don't like to sew over pins, when you get to that pin, get as close to that pin as you can get before you take that pin out, so it won't slip. And then as you get down to where the smocking starts, where that first pleat is, both in the front and the back, and match those 2 pleats together. And I would pin right here where your smocking is. I would pin 2 or 3 times so that you can keep those pleats straight right along there. And then when you sew, you're going to be sewing right up against that first pleat. And after you have stitched this seam, turn it right side out and check that area and make sure you're happy with it, because you can go back and you may have to stitch just a little bit closer the second time, but it will look really good. So then continue your seam all the way down your skirt, and you're going to be, when you start sewing, you're going to start sewing at the lining. So you'll have another pin up here so that your lining won't shift as you're sewing. So I've already done the other side, and was able to match my pleats right there at that side seam. So now the next thing you're going to do is you'll need to finish this seam, and you can do that by trimming it and just doing a small zigzag. I used my serger, and I often just use a 3 thread on my serger instead of that second needle, because I usually just use my serger for finishing seams. And then the next thing you'll need to do is press under the lining, press under just a scant 1/2 inch. You don't want your lining to pull tight when you stitch it to the top of that seam allowance where the skirt attaches to the bodice. So after you do that, you'll just be ready for buttonholes, buttons, and a hem. So I hope you have enjoyed making this Smocked Louise. I think it's a sweet way to add some smocking, maybe to an older girl's dress that maybe they think they've outgrown smocking. Well, smocking is really in right now, and they will be very much in style in this Smocked Louise. See you next time.